The parable of the prodigal son. Likely one of, if not the most famous of the parables, don't you think? And you're probably familiar with it. You know how it goes. You know who's good, who's bad in it, because Jesus told it. We've talked about it a lot. I mean, what more could I possibly say about it? The thing is, one of the reasons we're so familiar with it, I think, is because not just that we know the story. It's a little bit like the Good Samaritan, isn't it? We know the label, and we use it. We describe people as a prodigal son or daughter or sibling or a prodigal something. We use that expression quite frequently. It's made its way, in fact, the story has also made its way into literature and popular culture, movies. There's a TV show, I don't know if you saw this TV show, called Prodigal Son, where the son works for the FBI. And he was a profiler with the FBI, and then he ends up working for the NYPD, and he gets a case where it looks remarkably similar to something his father did. You see, because his father is a serial killer who's in prison because when he was a kid, he found out his father was a serial killer and called the police. And so the relationship there's been broken, and he's not seen him for years, and so he goes to see. Does that sound like the story of the prodigal son to you? It sounds like a really interesting take on it, given that I think basically somebody went with the title prodigal son and the way we use that expression. We use it all the time to mean somebody who's been away or left, and we haven't had any communication with them, and then they come back. Except that isn't what it means. Prodigal doesn't mean that. It means extravagantly, or somebody reckless even wasteful. All things that are, by the way, quite subjective. So when you describe somebody that way, it's you that's deciding that for them. And that's clearly what happens in the story, right? I mean, the son asks for the money and then leaves. And so, first of all, that would be extremely shameful to even ask in the first place, because you're basically saying, you're dead, so give me my inheritance. But also, it would have been shameful to the family in the village. It would have been just an awful thing to do. And then off he goes, and he spends the money. The thing is, we assume that he did that because he's a terrible person and wants to go away. What if he just wanted to find his own way? What if he didn't want to be a farmer? He wanted to go and live in the city for a while, see what it was like. Maybe he wasn't a bad guy. Maybe he just wanted to go and have a good time for a while. So he does. But he comes back. So maybe he did use all of that money in a prodigal way, right? Extravagantly. Maybe even recklessly or wastefully. But he comes back in part because he runs out. And by running out, it puts him in a position where he has to figure out exactly what is going on. In fact, in the story, Jesus says he comes to his senses. So his journey of figuring out things has arrived at this point where he's figured things out. So he goes back. He goes to. You can't really go back, can you? Which he discovers when he goes home. And instead of receiving a welcome from the villagers of possibly being stoned, or from the rest of his family of being cast out again, his dad welcomes him with love and wants to celebrate because he was lost and now he's found. He lost his way, he found his way home, and dad wants to celebrate. That's the story of the prodigal son, which is kind of interesting that we call this whole story the parable of the prodigal son, given that that's the only part of the story that's actually about the prodigal son. Isn't it? See, there's also this story of the resentful son. One might even suggest he was prodigal in his resentment, I suppose. But it's the brother who doesn't go. He stays. But then when he talks, you have to wonder whether he stayed because he wanted to or not. I've worked like a slave for you. Does that sound like somebody who was happy to be where he is? Or is it somebody who's just responding to that moment? He thought, good riddance on that guy. We don't need him. And here he is back. It's complicated, isn't it? But it's another piece of the story. It's, in fact, kind of another story because we don't know what happens with that brother. We hear he was angry. We hear the father goes out and invites him back in because the father, who has his own story of extravagant love for both his sons, invites him back in, but we don't know whether he goes because that's where Jesus stops the story, which, by the way, ought to be your hint as to that being the point of the story. I'll come back. But the thing is, there's three main characters in this story. Don't forget there are pigs. There's pigs in the story. How did they feel about all of this? They might have their own story. What about the guys? What about the people that the guy hung out with when he was in the city? There's a really cool song by a guy named Keith Green about this that tells the prodigal son story. But the way he tells the story, he doesn't throw all the weight on the shoulders of the son who leaves. He talks about in the song about how he met people who led him astray, who he spent his money on. Like he lived extravagantly, not necessarily recklessly, because he was just trying to have a good time. What about the family, the rest of the family? What about the villagers? What about the people that knew the family, that saw this happen? Where's their story? There's a lot of potential stories here. There are. Let's not just focus on the prodigal son. Let's think about those other stories, because maybe those are the pieces of the story that speak most to you. Have you ever had that experience where one of your siblings, disappears for a while and then comes back and everyone's, I'm happy but you were there the whole time? How do you feel about that? Because the thing is, Jesus doesn't actually necessarily say anybody's in the wrong in this story. He just tells the story for you to think about it. And maybe that's the point of the story. Its complexity is in order for us to engage the various pieces of the story, to see where we might encounter either extravagant love or extravagant wastefulness of things, extravagant resentment, extravagant bacon. Who knows? Where do you find your connection to this story? Because there's a lot there. I think it's really hard to say that the point of the prodigal son story is X, because there's Y and Z. There's, A through X even. There are so many things in this story. It's such a complicated story that can have so many layers. I've talked about this before, where parables have layers, except this one doesn't just have layers, it has the complexity of different relationships and things. Which, again, maybe is why it's one of, if not the most popular of the parables, is that there are so many ways into this story and so many things to talk about. I could talk about this for hours. I'm not gonna, but I could. People have written entire books. There are entire stories, books based on the idea of the story. There's so much in it. Here's the thing. Where does Jesus tell this story? And who's he talking to? Well, he's been spending all his time with all of the wrong people, as Jesus does. And the Pharisees and the scribes aren't really very approving of that. They're quite critical, in fact, that Jesus would spend all his time with these people that, let's be fair, the Pharisees and the scribes have marginalized to a very great extent, right? people whose behavior has been judged to be sinful, although it's not just the Pharisees and the scribes that do that. We all do that. We judge other people's behavior. And they say something about it, that Jesus is spending all his time with all the wrong people, with all the sinners, tax collectors. Anybody know anyone who works for Revenue Canada? Obviously, they are a sinner. Who are the people that we judge to be sinners? More importantly, why are you judging them to be sinners? So Jesus tells this story. First of all, he tells a story about a sheep that is lost and found, one of 99. And then he tells a story about someone who loses a coin, one of 10, but then spends all their time trying to find that one. And then he tells this story, these stories that are so interconnected. See, I think the Pharisees and the scribes are the son in this story, which is why that's where Jesus leaves it hanging. I know it's not particularly clear what happens with the younger son, right? He comes in, he's come home, he's feeling like he wants to be there. They have a party for him. He's very sorry about everything, but we don't know what happens to him after that. I like to think he stays and he finds his way into being part of the family again. The father's love for both his sons is pretty obvious all the way through the story. I mean, even from the very beginning, right? That he gives the money to the son in the first place. He was trying to be loving. He was being extravagant with his love. He's extravagant with his love all the way through the story to both sons. I imagine he's being extravagant with his love to everyone in his community and all of the people who work for him too, because he has a party to which everyone is invited. A party that's special enough to warrant killing the fatted calf, right? That's a big party. But we don't know whether the other son decides to come in or not. And by come in, I don't just mean into the party, I mean to come into the embrace of that love that the Father is showing to everyone. We don't know. It would be nice to think he does, because I don't think Jesus is cynical enough to leave that hanging. But on the other hand, he's telling this story in a very real context. It's a challenge to the scribes and the Pharisees. Are you going to come in? Or are you going to stand out there and just criticize me for spending all my time with the wrong people? Because that's exactly where Jesus wants us to go. Jesus wants us to go to all the wrong people. I've said this, I'm sure I've said this 1,000 times before. We've all heard this kind of thing said before. If Jesus were to come into Bashaw on a Sunday morning, there are 4 churches. Which one do you think he would go to? None of them. Because you don't need saving, you're here. Jesus would go and find the people who needed him, who needed love, who needed care. That's where he'd be. We don't know what happens at the end of the story, whether the other son goes in or not. But that is the challenge. Are you prepared to not judge and instead spend your time with those who need love and to be extravagant with that love? Are you prepared to let go a lot of the things that we have learned about the structures of society, in fact, about the structures of our own religious traditions, and just love like Jesus? It's not easy. And if you don't believe me, in a minute we're going to sing a classic hymn. So one of the things about all the older classic hymns, sometimes we worry about the theology or the language and stuff, but every now and then you hit on one that just goes, oh yeah, oh yeah. So we're going to sing that in a minute. But before we do, here's a guy sitting on a park bench.
I come from a background where it was all about knowledge of God. And so I have a lot of that. And for whatever reason, it has not made me more godly. I've not necessarily become more loving, more joyful, more peaceful. You've got the younger son who goes and he blows everything, takes out half his dad's money, ruins his father's reputation, ruins his own reputation. Turns around one day, finally remembers that his father is good, and that's the turning point, and heads back. And then only to find, he thought he was going to get beaten. He thought he was going to have to just work for his dad as a slave, but his dad comes running out, embraces him. "You're my son. I'm throwing you a party." My experience is more of the older son, and that's true for a lot of us who've grown up in the church, because we've got all that head knowledge, and we've, like the older son, done everything right and are doing our best and are working so hard. And yet when we find out that the younger son has returned and the father's throwing a party, that is not fair. I feel that is not fair. For most of my life, I've been jealous of the younger son because I've wanted the father to run out and embrace me when I've turned back. But I think that has been because I have not understood how the father comes outside of the house, disgraces himself to come get the older son as well. And so that father to the younger son says, "Come home." And that same father to the older son says, "Come inside." And I would say my movement here from just a head knowledge to also a heart knowledge has been one of coming inside, of putting down my tools, of putting down all my trying to get it right, and going in to join the party that's already going on. Still having a hard time doing that. Sometimes want to go out, pick up the tools again and do it just right, because that's what I know, that's what I feel safe with. And I think that's always the appeal of a very head faith, is that, we can sort of get a handle on it, we can get a grasp on it, we know to do these things and not do those things. Where that experience of heart is often so mysterious and inconsistent and difficult to get a grip on. And of course we need both. We need the head knowledge, we need the heart knowledge. But I've had mostly this and not much heart knowledge, and so I'm trying to balance out here a little bit to become a whole person in that. As much as I know about God, as much as I've experienced God, as much as I've seen Him work, as much as He has loved me through other people, most of the time I still think He's not very happy with me. I need to know that God loves me. I need to have it drop from my head into my heart, and it's still not quite there.